The Rainwater Killer, Episode 14, a Haunted Library exclusive series. I walked into the hospital with my mind not on my job, and my mind is always on my job. But this morning my thoughts were back home, fearing the worst case scenario even before my daughter had a chance to make it out of surgery. I felt guilty for not being there for her, but I also knew that there were some things in life that even I could not control. And I knew Lori would understand this, but I was still hard on myself. Lutz walked beside me as we made it to the third floor. Olivia White was in room 122. When we walked in the room, it was clear that she was still in shock. Her legs shook and her hands and arms trembled. A nurse had just given her a Valium to calm her down. Now I knew that this drug would take about 15 minutes to start working. But I didn't have 15 minutes, so I decided to get what I could out of her while trying to calm her as well. Hello, Mrs. White. I'm Detective Allen, and this is Sheriff Lutz. We're here to ask you a few questions in regards to your ordeal last night. Do you think you're okay to talk to us? She nodded, but I could tell she was a traumatized wreck. I began to ask questions as Lutz looked on. I asked her to tell me exactly what happened, from the time she left her house to the moment she was taken against her will. She stated that nobody had been following her throughout the day, nothing suspicious in the past few weeks or days leading up to last night. It appeared it was simply another random attack and she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was frustrated that these people were still out jogging around and walking around, but I knew this was going to happen in New York. I asked her about the abduction and what exactly had transpired. She informed us that the attacker was never violent and did not harm her for the most part. She didn't have any cuts or abrasions, just some bruising on her ankles from the tripwire she had stepped into. I was beginning to lean towards the reality that our man most definitely had a military background, as I'd already been suspecting. I asked if she'd recognized her assailant, or recognized his voice, or anything that may be familiar. Nothing was. My biggest takeaway from the interview was that he did not kill her or sexually assault her. But then again, sexual deviance did not seem to follow his pattern, as none of the previous victims had been raped. She confirmed that he was wearing a rain mask and his height and weight matched up to the Rainwater Killer. I knew as I stood there talking to her, her head could have easily been detached, as was Shane Wallace's. She was fortunate to be laying in a hospital bed, all body parts still fully intact, and not cold on an examination table in a lab, dead as a doorknob. She would be traumatized for life, sure, but she was alive. It was like a game to this guy, it seemed, and sometimes he was simply a ruthless killer. Tonight he seemed to just want to play. One thing was for sure, he wasn't scared of allowing a victim to escape alive, as this wasn't the first time that had happened. Hence the lack of physical evidence thus far, so obviously he knew what he was doing and he had confidence in letting his victims escape. It was almost like he was teasing us. I ended the short interview and we took her clothes for possible prints. Once back in Lutz's car, I wondered if we may get lucky this time and find some prints on the rope or around the scene of the crime. Units were already out there combing the area. Unfortunately, I was going to have to let Larson help me out on this because I needed to catch a flight back to Arkansas. The following narration is from a third-person point of view. P.I. Jimmy Keene watched the house as rain fell. It was 11 p.m., and tonight he was in yet a different car parked in a neighbor's driveway. The residents had been nice enough to allow police surveillance, so he was taking turns in various driveways with different vehicles nightly. It wasn't exactly covert, but it was still smart and sneaky. He had been there a few hours, glancing at his laptop, sometimes checking the YouTube channel on his cell phone that was playing some old CBS mystery radio. He wasn't totally invested in the story, as he checked the house that was under suspicion periodically. This particular vehicle did not have tinted windows. This was good and bad, of course, but it did allow him to see things a little bit clearer. A sense of urgency in the department had risen today after last night's kidnapping. When the story of Olivia White broke the 5 o'clock news, it seemed as though the citizens of New York had finally had enough. Of course, this kidnapping was linked to the Rainwater killer slayings, and there were now rumors of some New Yorkers forming vigilante groups to hunt down the killer and to protect themselves. He had heard all this from Detective Allen before he had jumped on the plane. He liked Allen, but he didn't care for Sheriff Lutz. Never before had he met a detective so smart, so yet down to earth, and like his own track record, Allen spoke for itself as well. Of course, there was a huge incentive on catching this guy, and everybody was working tirelessly to try to crack the case. But the problem was, there was little to no evidence left behind at the scenes, which he had mostly been denied access to and been told very little about. He wanted this case more than any other case he'd worked. He was used to having the police shun him, as this was the norm when private eyes tried to butt in on a case to help the victim, after the victim had lost hope in the police apprehending the suspect. But he had been contacted by the NYPD on this, not the other way around. He had been asked to help, and he was shocked and pleased by this. Since working the case, he had lost sleep, become more stressed and aggravated, and had begun to suspect an NYPD officer, but he couldn't be sure yet. It was the most frustrating murder investigation that he had ever worked. Even the letters sent to the station had no prints or palm prints for police to work with. He glanced back at the house, which was 2 lots to his right. Rain continued to pelt the windows, and the car soon became chilly. He was tempted to turn on the ignition to warm the car, but he resisted. Around 12 a.m., a light in the back bedroom came on, and this would be the same bedroom they were looking at, even though they were trying to watch the whole house as well. He turned off his laptop and shifted in the seat, concentrating on the window. The blinds were pulled. As soon as the light came on, it flickered off. He got out, grabbed his jacket, and started towards the Sullivan residence. A little overweight at plus 220 pounds, he had to be careful. He wasn't that agile. It wasn't his first time he had went into the danger zone on the job, such as trespassing on a potential killer's property. He could easily be shot. He let himself into the privacy fence and crept alongside of the modest brick home. It was very residential here, unlike downtown New York. It looked like a neighborhood right out of the heartland, down south. When he got to the window in question, he was surprised to see that the window was fully open. There was a screen, and the blinds were still closed. Inside, he began to hear faint sounds, as if somebody were talking or mumbling. He listened, trying to hold his breaths in. The sounds began to grow louder and stranger. His skin went cold, and his intuition told him something wasn't right inside that dark room. Somebody was in there, talking to himself, which was very bizarre in itself. The man inside the room, presumably Mr. Sullivan, was carrying on a conversation with himself. He was speaking in a deep voice, then portraying a younger voice, perhaps himself at a younger age. Keene wasn't sure. But both voices held a southern accent. The dominant voice, which Keene took to be his mom, had told him in so many words to get the fuck out of the house for the night in the rain and sleep in the doghouse. This was followed by a lighter, almost pathetic voice pleading. Finally, the submissive voice relented as the deeper voice was heard pushing the other person out of a room, or a house. Regardless, the bedroom door closed. Chills went up his back as he listened. He didn't think much of the door shutting until a few moments later when a sound came across the front yard. It was another door closing, the front door. The bedroom door had shut at the order of the dominant voice, instructing somebody to go outside for the night, demanding that somebody go outside for the night. Presumably Sullivan, but Keene wasn't sure. This was all speculation right now. He didn't think Sullivan would exit from the front, however. If anything, it would presumably be the back door that he would most likely exit from, since the doghouse was in the backyard, and the doghouse was brought up in the conversation. Keene's chest thumped as he knew Sullivan was approaching the side of the house. He bolted around the back as quietly as he could, passing the patio doors and making a 360 around the house, finally easing up to the front of the gate again. Out of breath, he peered into the cracks of the wooden fence to see Sullivan indeed enter the backyard. Just moments before, he had been standing there. He took slow breaths from the short but abrupt sprint. Sullivan stood in the backyard now, looking around for a moment. He had a hammer in his hand. Keene gripped his handgun that he carried as an open conceal, his eyes wide looking through the fence. Sullivan began to slowly approach the gate, hammer dangling loosely from his hand. Keene pulled his gun. If he ran, he would blow his cover. He tensed and waited. Sullivan stopped at the window and looked around, as if knowing that he had just been standing there. After a few moments, he walked past the window towards Keene. He was now just 2 feet from Keene, who was a statue on the other side of the fence. Only the fence separated the two men as rain fell lightly. After what seemed like forever, Sullivan turned around without opening the gate and headed back towards the yard. Keene waited until he heard the footsteps grow faint before he turned to take a peek and breathe. He could make out the outline of Sullivan thanks to a neighbor's porch light, as he watched him slowly climb into a large doghouse, just as he had shortly ago instructed himself to do. Keene turned back, facing the road. He wiped sweat from his forehead that had come during the tense standoff. It was 50 degrees out here, and he was sweating. He was sure Sullivan would have opened the gate and there would have been an encounter, and that would have blown his cover for good. His anxiety was high, but despite, he purposely stayed in that spot to get his composure. It wouldn't be until later on that he'd realized that he had actually been too frightened to move from that spot, too frozen in terror. From the high strangeness of the two voices in the dark, to the close encounter, to the fact Sullivan was still in the doghouse, and didn't plan on coming back out, it seemed. Either way, Keene didn't plan on finding out. He finally got the nerve to take a few steps away from the fence and slowly walk back to his car. He drove away for the night very disturbed. In his opinion, if Patrick Sullivan was not the Rainwater killer, he was the most disturbed individual that Keene had ever laid eyes on.